Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Keogh, I'm dietitian with the Celiac Society. You're all very welcome to our webinar today. Excuse me. We're just going to give everybody another couple of minutes just to join. We still have quite a few people kind of joining already, and we'll just kick off in a few minutes. Okay, so I think most people have joined at this stage, so we're going to kick off. You're very welcome to Finding Fibre on a Gluten-Free Diet. The reason we are running this particular session is we do get huge amounts of questions in the Celiac Society all the time about people running into issues with digestion. And, you know, with celiac disease, there's lots of digestive symptoms, and then you go on the gluten-free diet and you're feeling a whole lot better. And then suddenly there's other digestive issues come along, particularly people run into problems with kind of sluggish digestion, kind of constipation and things like that. So there's, as I said, this is something we get a lot of questions about. So that's why we're going to cover it for you today. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20-25 minutes. We have chat on the side here. If you have any questions as we're going along, please pop your questions into the chat. If you want to, at the end, I'm going to stop and we can have a conversation, and you're welcome to just unmute yourself and come through and talk about come in and talk about anything that you want or ask any questions of us as we're going along. So where do we start? So I want to just talk very briefly about what does your gut do for you. And I think very few people are more aware of their gut and their digestion than people with celiac disease. But your gut does an awful lot of things. It's going to digest your food. So as it comes in, we break it down, we get it into a paste, and then it goes through all the enzymes, and then we absorb the nutrition from it. So when we're absorbing our nutrients, it's going to support our immunity. So a healthy gut is a really important part of a very healthy immune system. And it actually contributes to weight management. We know that having a healthy gut, and particularly healthy gut bacteria, are a really big part of just even managing weight. We're seeing big links with that. And that can actually impact mood as well. We know now from research that having a healthy gut actually is incredibly important for sort of good mental health. So we want to have a healthy gut. And it's lovely if you have celiac disease, and, you know, a lot of people have gone through the mill to get diagnosed and they're feeling a whole lot better, and then suddenly there's running into problems again. So we want to just make sure the gut is nice and healthy, and not just that, you know, we're kind of regular, but that we get all the benefits that are out there from a nice healthy gut. So fibre is probably the most famous thing we talk about when it comes to healthy digestion. And one of the nice ways to think about fibre is that it actually cleans your gut. I often would talk about fibre being like this great big sweeping brush that just goes through your digestive system and just clears everything out and kind of keeps it nice and clean. There was a big fad for people getting colonic irrigation there a few years ago, and we were saying, you know, I'm going to wash out my bowel. And it's like, you know, we saw a lot of injuries from people having that done if it was with people who really didn't know what they were doing. But if you're getting your fibre in, that natural cleaning is just happening all by itself. The big problem is that 80% of us just generally don't eat enough fibre. So we don't always get that nice benefit of just getting the gut cleaned out. But fibre is also food for your gut bacteria. So we talk a lot about probiotics and prebiotics and all of these things, but actually one of the most important things to do for healthy gut bacteria is eating fibre, because that is their food and that's going to help them to grow. One of the problems I see all the time when it comes to fibre is that there's less fibre in food than most people think. You know, when I talk to people about fibre, everybody thinks they're eating enough fibre, but most of the time they're actually not. And the foods that we would often talk about for fibre would be things like whole grain breads and cereals. And straight away, when you're celiac, you can see where that's an issue. A lot of the cereals and breads, the high fibre breads and the brown soda breads suddenly are gone. Now, there's gluten-free varieties, and we'll talk a bit about more about those in a minute. But I find a lot of people suddenly eat less bread. Even if they find nice gluten-free bread that they like, it tends to be less because they wouldn't be eating so much bread out, maybe in restaurants and things like that, depending on what's available. But we can get fibre in fruit and veg, nuts and seeds, beans and lentils, and we'll talk through all of those as we go. But I want to have a look at really fibre and celiac disease. So constipation is a really common problem in celiac disease, and it can actually be one of the symptoms. For a long time, if you go back 30, 40 years ago, there was this idea that you could only have celiac disease if you were having really bad diarrhea and you were losing lots of weight and all of that. We now know that actually constipation can be a really, really common cause or a common symptom of it as well. So someone who's got constipation where just nothing is fixing it really is often needs to be tested for celiac disease. But apart from one of the symptoms, it can actually become common after diagnosis. So you do get people who have the diarrhea type celiac disease, and then as soon as they went on the gluten-free diet, suddenly things have ground to an absolute halt. So what happens there is that someone has gone on the gluten-free diet, but now they might never have been eating much fibre, or they might have reduced their fibre once they started on the gluten-free diet, but suddenly a problem of constipation has arrived, and it is really common for people to go literally from one extreme to another with it. And the issue is that a lot of our traditional high fibre foods are just not suitable on a gluten-free diet. So what can we do? Well, the first thing to think about with constipation is there are lots and lots of causes. So lack of fibre is hands down the biggest one. No doubt about it, it's the most common cause for constipation and a sluggish bowel, a sluggish digestion. But poor intake of fluids, if you're not drinking enough water through the day, if you eat lots of fibre, but fibre works by getting into your gut and sort of soaking up liquid and getting nice and soft so everything moves. If you don't have enough liquid coming in, there's nothing for the digestive system to sort of soak up. So you have to have your water as well as your fibre. People can have irritable bowel syndrome, and they can have that as well as celiac disease. Although let's remember, about 15% of people with irritable bowel syndrome actually have celiac disease, and it has just not been tested or maybe missed. Stress and anxiety definitely can impact the bowel. So lots of people will notice that they're more likely to get bloating or a little bit slow down when they're stressed. You can have the opposite as well. Stress is just interesting in what it does to the body. Different medical conditions can do it. Medication, certain, if people are on, if they're in a lot of pain, they're on a pain medication can really slow down the bowel. Anyone who's been pregnant will know those last 2 months of pregnancy, when all the hormones are getting the body ready for giving birth, it relaxes all the muscles, but it relaxes the bowel muscles as well. So really severe constipation in the last sort of, 6 to 8 weeks of pregnancy is very common. Lack of exercise. We need movement to literally sort of pump the gut. And, the next time you're out for a walk, if you actually put your hand on your abdomen, you'll feel your tummy muscles moving as you walk. And they're actually just doing a little pumping onto the gut to keep things moving as well. So if someone is doing absolutely no exercise, if they're in bed, maybe if they're sick, it's very, very common to get constipation there as well. But in celiac disease, obviously all of those things can apply, so we'd often look at that. But the three things that I would see as the issue would be a lack of fibre, followed by accidental gluten. So quite often if I'm working with somebody and it turns out that they are constipated and we're trying to find out what's going on, quite often there's just gluten coming in somewhere. And especially if constipation was their original symptom for celiac disease, suddenly, maybe they've used a new brand of stock cubes and they didn't check it was in the book, or maybe they were eating in a new restaurant and maybe something was accidentally happening there. Maybe there was cross-contamination, those kind of little, sometimes it's worth going through and just seeing, is there a bit of gluten coming in somewhere that we didn't realize? And then sensitivity to oats can be an issue there as well. So I'm going to put up the next slide. I warn you, actually has pictures of poo on it. So if you're a bit sensitive, you can look away, but I have a reason for what I'm going to talk about here. And this is the Bristol stool chart. And this kind of breaks down the what we call the 7 kinds of poo. And I often find that we might talk about constipation or diarrhea or normal and maybe not be aware of what normal is or what healthy is when it comes. And particularly when I talk to people with celiac disease, they often don't realize that what they think is normal is actually still quite sort of liquidy for everybody else. So if we have a look at the chart, we have all the 7 types of poo basically. And type 1 is the little hard lumps. So as someone said to me, it's like having little Brussels sprouts. And this is what we call constipation. This would be generally lack of fibre or lack of liquid would be your cause for this. When those little lumps are kind of stuck together, they're kind of like a sausage, but it's very lumpy and you can see the sort of individual pieces. I know you're going to all be spending an awful lot of time looking into the loo after this. So what we call a cracked sausage, so where it's fairly smooth, but there's a few splits or cracks in it, or a smooth banana. This is what you're aiming for in terms of being healthy. So type 3 and 4 is a nice, healthy, what should be coming out. If you're eating, enough fiber, you've got enough fluid coming in, doing a little bit of exercise, this is kind of what you should be producing. We get into then the type 5, which is kind of soft and blobby. And this is a lot of people with celiac disease who maybe took years to get diagnosed. They were having maybe this type 5, maybe once or twice a week or every couple of weeks and not really thinking anything about it. That shouldn't be happening regularly. And then obviously we get into the really fluffy and the liquid. So today we're really looking on this end of things, kind of, are you getting sort of the hard pieces and the hard pieces stuck together? And we want to move into this. And these two really show up when you have a lack of fiber. So that's the worst slide of this whole talk done. So I said the first thing is just check, are you definitely gluten-free? Just quite often it is just, you think you're doing everything right and then you're like, oh, right, that I didn't realize, or something like that. So just make sure, the breads and pastas are gluten-free. That's always the obvious one. I have to say nobody gets that one wrong, but I throw it up there just it's there. So your breads, cakes, biscuits, everybody gets the gluten-free ones, those, and they're fantastic. But the other thing is make sure you're using your celiac app or your food list. It's an ongoing problem that we have in that, manufacturers have to put the ingredient list onto the label. And so if there's any gluten in that, that is going to stand out. But the may contain is optional. So they don't have to tell you if there's a possibility there's gluten in there. Now, most do. In all fairness, most manufacturers will let you know. But the problem is if there's no may contain label on it, you don't know. And that's where the difficulty can show up. So what can happen is maybe something is made in a factory where there is flour and there's a chance that that's coming across, but it's not on the label for you. So we would see certainly there's a good few products out there that would have no mention of gluten in the ingredient list and no mention of cross-contamination. But when we actually contact the manufacturer with the Celiac Society and we talk to them and say, are your foods suitable for celiacs? And they'll go, no. They'll say sometimes what it is that the product is occasionally suitable, but other times if they have a different supplier or if they move to a different location, it can actually suddenly then have a little bit of gluten in there. So it's actually really important using your food list, using your food app, and just checking and checking. Now, any food that's labeled gluten-free, the rules around that are really strict and they're checked, so they're absolutely fine. So if you have a gluten-free food that's not in the food list, it's fine. And then foods that are naturally gluten-free, we don't have in the list. And it would just be vast if we did. So things like, milk and meat and chicken and fish and eggs and fruit and veg, they're not going to be in the app. But for anything that's kind of packaged, anything that has a few different ingredients in it, even some things that maybe have one ingredient but would be a higher risk of cross-contamination, they'll be in the book. So, for example, corn flour itself is gluten-free, but actually some brands are cross-contaminated with gluten and some are not. So that's why you need to check your book for those. So just, if you are having a lot of constipation, it's useful to get your app out or your food list and just go through your kitchen, check your stock cubes, check your tomato ketchup, check your mayonnaise, check your herbs and spices. We have a huge issue with lots and lots of herbs now. Manufacturers are saying that these days there's a lot more contamination with those. So, just make sure that you have that because it's always worth checking. For me, I think you've enough to be doing with a gluten-free diet without having to start cutting out or adding in a whole lot of other things. So it really is just worth checking that the gluten isn't coming in and that isn't causing the constipation for you. But also look at your cross-contamination. And some people are brilliant on this and well aware, and I'm still getting people in the clinic and nobody's ever spoken to them about cross-contamination and they didn't know they needed a separate toaster and they didn't know that you can't cook chicken nuggets in a deep fat fryer and then put the chips in and the chips will be gluten-free because they'll be covered in the gluten. So they don't know some of those cross-contamination. So I would look, we're seeing people getting cross-contamination from tea towels and kitchen cloths that, someone has kind of used a kitchen cloth to wipe down flour and then you've used it to wash something else, but there's now gluten over everything. So really just getting some good information on your cross-contamination, checking, what's going on at home, have you got your separate butter, all of those things. The one thing I'd say to you as well, and I see this a lot, no one is ever slightly celiac. Because we do know that about 40% of people with celiac disease will get sick quite quickly if they eat gluten, usually within about 2 hours. But 60% of people with celiac disease don't feel anything, or they might feel a little bit bloated. So they might not, if they eat gluten, they might not necessarily know it straight away. But what happens sometimes is I hear people saying, well, I'm slightly celiac. You know, my friend gets sick straight away. I don't. I'm only slightly celiac. And sadly, no. It's a bit like saying I'm slightly pregnant. You know, if one person has morning sickness and the other person doesn't have morning sickness, you're still both pregnant, if you know what I mean. So there's no slightly celiac. So even if you're thinking, well, I can have a little bit of gluten now and again, no. And it might be the cause of your constipation that you kind of thought, well, it's okay for me, but actually it isn't anyway, just because although you mightn't feel sick straight away, you'll still have all the internal damage. But just, yeah, even if you're one of those people who's talking about slightly celiac, just check that out. Another one I see quite commonly is, are you sensitive to oats? So oats is an interesting one with celiac disease. Oats themselves don't have any gluten, but generally ordinary oats will pick up gluten. So they might be grown in a field next to a wheat field. They might be harvested in a combine harvester that did the wheat field yesterday. They might be stored. So a lot of what we call ordinary oats that you would buy, ordinary porridge, all of that generally have quite a lot of gluten in them. So you can get gluten-free oats. So they're oats grown separately, harvested separately, stored there, all of that to make sure they're definitely gluten-free. So for 95% of people with celiac disease, the gluten-free oats are fantastic. However, around 5% of people with celiac disease react to a different protein in oats called avenin. So with celiac disease, it's usually gluten, but with some people, the avenin is an issue as well. So even if you're using gluten-free oats, sometimes the oats might be the issue. And for a lot of people, that can be the cause of constipation or can be the cause of bloating. Now, as I said, I'd go back, I would always check the gluten first. I would always make sure you're definitely gluten-free, because again, the gluten-free diet's quite restricted anyway, and you really only want to take oats out if you absolutely have to. Now, the problem I do see a lot of the times when I be talking to people and saying maybe we'll do a trial of taking out oats is people remember to take out the porridge, but they don't remember to take out, you know, the cereal bars, which often have oats in them. So you'll get lots of gluten-free foods that will still contain oats, which, you know, it can be a bit of a struggle for people who are celiac and sensitive to oats. That they, you know, it's not enough anywhere for them to look at something gluten-free. They've got to check the ingredient list and see are there oats in there as well. So if you think you might be oat sensitive, you know, check your cereal bars, cakes, biscuits, crackers. Some gluten-free breads will also be made with oats and will have oats in it. So if you are sensitive to oats, or you think you might be, just make sure you're checking all of those out for yourself as well. So the big one, are you eating enough fiber? So, you know, a lot of the time this is the issue. So if you've kind of checked, you're definitely gluten-free. You know, we may or may not look at the oats would be the last place I'd look, to be honest, but we try and get the fiber in first. So as I mentioned earlier, 80% of people in Ireland don't eat enough fiber, but this is even higher in people with celiac disease. We see that once people go on a gluten-free diet, their fiber generally falls. And again, it's because the traditional high fiber foods are out. But there's loads of places to get fibre that aren't wheat and bread and things like that. So all your seeds, and this fashion we've seen in the last few years for putting seeds into everything is fantastic. Linseed, linseeds, flax seeds, chia seeds, sunflower, pumpkin, any of those are going to be brilliant. They can be ground up, they can be whole, and they are naturally gluten-free. Very occasionally you might see a may contain gluten on some of the packets for that. So if you happen to see that, leave it alone. But otherwise, they're actually fine, and you're going to be fine to go with those. The ground up ones, you'll see brands in the book, because once they're going through a process, we'll just be a little more careful, and you'll find those in your food list or your app just to check. Things like beans and lentils. Now, obviously, baked beans, you're going to have to check because the whole sauce in there. But if you're just getting beans that are dried beans, and even the tin beans, they would be naturally gluten-free. Again, just recently, we're starting to see more manufacturers putting a may contain gluten on particularly lentils. So we're seeing it a little bit more on dried lentils, and we're seeing it a little bit more on some of the tins of lentils. So again, just check those and just check other ones. And we're just looking into it to see what's going on, and we'll have an update kind of with the food list this year about that. All your fruit is gluten-free, your fresh fruit, all your fresh vegetables are gluten-free. Your frozen fruit and vegetables are almost always gluten-free. Rarely you might see, sometimes with frozen fruit, there can be a little bit of flour just to stop them from sticking. I haven't seen it in years, but it was a thing anyway, but just keep an eye on that with the frozen. But your high fiber gluten-free breads and cereals. So if you have a look, there's huge variation in fiber levels between different gluten-free breads. So you can look for the brown gluten-free breads, but even individually, it's worth checking the label just to see how much fiber is on the back of it. So any food that has 6 grams of fiber or more per 100 grams is a high fiber food. So if you are looking at gluten-free breads, just check the label. Some of them actually have a lot of fiber. There's a couple of, some of them have like 6, 7, 8 grams of fiber per slice, which is brilliant. So it's really good to think about. And then obviously porridge, if you can tolerate your oats, your porridge is going to be fantastic. So when we actually think about how do we go about actually eating more fibre, the key thing is you need high fibre foods at every meal. So we spoke about that you need 25 grams of fibre a day as a minimum. Now, if you have, like if we just even take porridge, if you have a bowl of porridge in the morning, you get around 3 or 4 grams of fibre from that. So you need 25, a bowl of porridge will give you 3 or 4. So you're going to need another 20 grams in the day. So if you're someone who only thinks about fibre first thing in the morning, you're going to have a real difficulty getting to your target. So you have to think about fibre at every meal. So some form of high fibre cereal in the morning. Now it might be the case that you have a nice gluten-free cereal that you have in the morning that has fibre in it, or you're using some high fibre gluten-free bread. Otherwise, if you're doing other things, put in your seeds. This is a great time to add a spoonful or two of seeds to your breakfast. You might even put them into a smoothie for yourself. They go really well into things like yogurt. So just think about getting, a couple of dessert spoons of different seeds in there. Plan to have at least a third of your meals some sort of fruit and veg, right? You can push that up to half your plate, but if you look at your breakfast in the morning, kind of a third of what you eat there, if that was some fruit, that would be brilliant. So that can be your apples, bananas, grapes, anything that you want to have in the morning. At lunchtime, if you just have a sandwich at lunchtime, it can end up being 90% bread. So can you add a bowl of vegetable soup there? Can you add a side salad there? Can you have a couple of pieces of fruit with your lunch? So that you're just getting your fruit and veg in there. And again, when you look at your plate for dinner, at least a third of what goes on your plate at dinner, salad, vegetables, stir fry, whatever way you're doing it, but just that you're really bringing those. And that's a really good way to get, good for overall nutrition, but it's going to give you lots of fibre as well. Do choose your high fibre gluten-free bread. So just what I was saying, check your labels, just see, can you choose one that has plenty of fibre in it? Adding your nuts and seeds to breakfast. But beans and lentils are brilliant, as I mentioned, for fibre, and they go really well into soups. They go into, you can make bean salads, you can roast chickpeas. We have a recipe on the website for gluten-free roast chickpeas, which are a really nice snack, but really high in fibre as well. Lots of vegetarian recipes that are based on beans and lentils are great ways to add those in. They're just such a good way, and they're one of the best ways to get fibre in because, we talk about getting this 25 grams of fibre a day. If you have a half tin of, say, chickpeas or kidney beans, they're going to give you about 10 grams of fibre. So it's a really good chunk out of what you need for the day. I would say, though, take it slowly. If you go from like 5 grams of fibre to 25 overnight, your digestive system will not thank you. You are going to get an awful lot of gas and noise and a bit of a funny tummy. So you need to take it slowly with fibre. You need to add in one new high fibre food and give your gut sort of 3 or 4 days to kind of get used to it, and then you can add it again. So you might say, well, look, I'm going to start with seeds, and you might put in 1 spoonful of seeds and give your body 2 or 3 days, and then put it up to the second spoonful of seeds and go from there. And the same with if you're not someone who eats a whole lot of fruit and veg, I wouldn't go 3 meals a day on the first day. I just bring it in. So just take your time with this one. If it takes you 3 weeks to sort of bring your fibre up, far better off, because otherwise what I see lots of people do is they go, well, I'm going to go on this high fibre diet, and they eat all the fibre in one day, and then they feel awful, and then they come back and go, well, I'm obviously allergic to fibre. And while we can all have sensitivities to everything, it's really important just to take your time really nice and slowly with your fibre. And I just put this menu together because I wanted you just to have a look at where we think fibre is coming in. So this is kind of a very, very rough day of what someone is eating. So, they're having gluten-free porridge for breakfast, they're having a gluten-free biscuit mid-morning, they're having, gluten-free bread with chicken and salad in a sandwich at lunchtime, they're having an apple, and at dinner we're having broccoli and carrots. So, when I see people, they'd be saying, well, this is what I'm eating. I have loads of fibre coming in here, but how much fibre is actually in here? And remember, we're looking for 25 a day. So if you actually add that up, you're looking at 9, maybe 10 grams of fibre with that. So it's, even though you're looking at that, you're thinking, well, there's porridge, there's fruit, there's veg. As I said to you, there's often less fibre in food than you might expect. So how do we get up to our 25? So this is where we have the porridge, but we put in our 2 dessert spoons of seeds. So we've added 6 grams straight away with that. And instead of a biscuit mid-morning, or as well as, if you want to, your pear is in there, and that's giving you 2 grams of fibre. You have a high fibre gluten-free bread, that brings it up to 4. And actually, depending on what, some brands, it can actually bring it up to 14. And then as well as your salad, you're also adding in an apple at lunchtime, so you have another 2 grams. Snack in the afternoon is a handful of nuts, which is giving you 3. And then your dinner is the same. You're still getting the, except that you put in a baked potato here, and you've eaten the skin on the baked potato. So here we are, at least kind of 26 grams of fibre with that. So you can see the difference just adding in a little bit more fruit, adding in the seeds with that, adding in the nuts, going for the high fibre bread, going for the jacket potato can just top up the fibre, and it just gives you an idea of where you're going with it. Now, once you've done all the fibre and everything else, I'm just going to mention irritable bowel syndrome. Now, most people with celiac disease are very used to it. And as I said, a lot of people for years thought they had irritable bowel syndrome, and it turned out to actually be celiac disease. However, you can have irritable bowel as well as celiac disease. So it's just worth mentioning. And it can have it can look very similar. You can have the bloating, diarrhea or constipation, a lot of gas, can be quite tired, can have cramps, just be, really uncomfortable. And a low FODMAP diet, which is a diet that's low in what we call fermentable carbohydrate, actually can help for a lot of people. But before you all run out and do this, although you can have celiac disease and irritable bowel syndrome, I find most of the people who would come in, particularly to the clinic in the Celiac Society, and would say, I think I have IBS as well, most of the time, it turns out there's either gluten coming in somewhere, or they're sensitive to oats, or they're not eating enough fibre. So if you have celiac disease, I'd be thinking around that first, and I'd really be checking all of those things before. It's only really when you've ruled out all of that that you might look at irritable bowel. And even with that, some people are super sensitive to gluten. So, for most people, if you're eating under, and we talk about this famous 20 parts per million for gluten every day, but some people will be extraordinarily sensitive. And sometimes we might do what's called a very, very absolutely 100% gluten-free sort of type diet. And sometimes that can work. So I wouldn't do this on your own. If you're celiac and you think it might have irritable bowel syndrome, before you sort of think, oh, is it IBS? Definitely maybe check in with your dietitian and just make sure that you've really gone into detail and made sure that the gluten is not the issue. If you do think that it's low FODMAP diet, you can Google this everywhere, and there's, you get diet sheets all over the place. I would just caution you, it's a very complicated diet to get right. I know over the years when I've been working with people, and if we're looking at irritable bowel, I might say to someone, right, we're going to try the low FODMAP diet. They'll often say, well, I've tried it already, it didn't work. But they tried it from a sheet on the internet, and when we actually do it properly, it does work. So I would say to you, although you can read all about this online, it's a fiddly complicated diet to get right. So make sure you work, if you want to do this, to work with a CORU registered dietitian who's FODMAP trained. So it's important because there's a really high risk of nutritional deficiencies with this. You have to have a reintroduction phase, and a lot of people who do it on their own skip that part. And I think with celiac disease, often you have enough restriction as it is without necessarily needing to go on to do anything else. Just be cautious as well about intolerance testing. If you think there's something funny going on with your gut, definitely worth talking to your dietitian. The kind of, we see a lot of advertising for food intolerance testing, and I get lots of people who've spent money on this, but the HPRA, which is the Health Products Regulatory Authority in Ireland, and they regulate all the medicines and testing and everything that comes in. They have really looked at all of these, and there's a statement on their website if you want to have a look, and they just say, look, these tests do not actually diagnose food intolerance. So whether it's an IgG test, hair testing, any of those, they don't actually just basically you're spending your money, the results you get back are just of no use to anything. So, and they can be expensive. I've seen people spend 200 and 300 euros on these tests. Save your money. Go and see your registered dietitian who knows about celiac disease, who knows about irritable bowel and low FODMAP. It'll be cheaper, and you're more likely to actually get somewhere with it. So just before you spend money on those things. So basically, what can we do for our gut? We are going to make sure we have enough fibre coming in. You're going to feed your gut bacteria. So that is a lot of that is just putting your fibre in. Water so that you've got lots of fluid coming in. Good eating habits. It's nice for your digestion just to sit down, eat slowly, chew your food properly, give it a little bit of time. If you're rushing everywhere, that can be its own issue with the gut. A little bit of exercise so that you're just keeping everything moving. Do maintain a strict gluten-free diet. That's your big one. And then if you do, we have a dietitian clinic at the Celiac Society, and you can actually book in at info@celiac.ie. So thank you for joining us all today. I see we actually already have a few questions coming up in the chat. So I'm just going to pop these down. But if you have any questions at all, just pop them into the chat, or if you want to put your hand up, I can come to you. Now, let me just have a quick look here. So can I get this to watch again because I missed the start? Yes, absolutely. This is going to be, we're recording it, and it'll be available on the Celiac website, so you will be able to go back in and have another look. Jennifer has Moroccan chickpea soup up, and Frances, who's our chef and who's fabulous, and she has loads of recipes on the website. Frances we actually have a good few. If you look at our Minding Me gluten-free course, we have a whole section on high fibre foods, and Frances has done some amazing recipes with that. So really worth going in there to have a look. Sorry now, someone is saying regarding the food list, tilde 250 grams brown basmati rice is on the app, but the 500 gram size is not listed. It states it's gluten-free. Is it safe? Yeah, all rice is going to be gluten-free unless it's flavored. So what we're working to do at the moment is try and get all the naturally gluten-free into one space and the ones that might be flavored into the other with it. So with rice, unless there's a flavor added, your rice is all going to be gluten-free. The only time the problem is that really there shouldn't be a gluten-free label on foods where all of them would be gluten-free, because it's exactly that confusion that you think, well, if this packet of rice says gluten-free, does that mean all the other rice isn't gluten-free? But actually all rice is gluten-free unless it's flavored. Now, again, every so often, sometimes a manufacturer will put a may contain gluten on. We track that as much as we can, but for yourself, if you happen to see it, you do have to stay away from the may contains with it. But just to say that all your rice, all your plain brown rice, white rice, basmati rice, long grain rice, your risotto rice, all of those are going to be naturally gluten-free. So you don't even need to check those in the book. They're going to be fine. Is there a list of Koru dietitians available? Yep, I mean, we've the clinic at Celiac Society, and there's a website called sedi.ie, so sedi.ie, and you'll actually find information on Koru registered dietitians there. You've said that accidental gluten can cause constipation. I experienced quite the opposite. Well, that can definitely, you can get both. I experienced a horrendous experience of diarrhea. So this is the thing with celiac disease. It's definitely not one reaction for everybody. And as I said, about 40% of people, if they eat gluten, so 40% of people with celiac disease, if they eat gluten, they will get maybe vomiting. The diarrhea would be the big ones, the big reaction to that, absolutely. But also there'd be people who'll get constipation. So it's very mixed. And that's why I think sometimes people don't often think that gluten might be the problem, because they're expecting if they eat gluten that they're going to get diarrhea, but actually quite a few people don't. So it's just part of the wonderful world of celiac disease, where it's just a little bit different for everybody. God love you. I hope it got better for you. Do I recommend any probiotics? Don't find any particular probiotics for these conditions useful. With probiotics, I'm always looking for more research and more information. And the thing about probiotics is they're often quite specific. I see people sort of just taking a probiotic, and it's the same thing as sort of taking a medicine. Like, what are you taking the medicine for? Is it a painkiller? Is it going to lower your cholesterol? Like, what is your target with it? So people often talk about general gut health. Well, if you're looking for general gut health, put your fibre in, get your exercise, lots of different high fibre foods, and drink your water. You're going to feed your gut bacteria with your fibre, and that's the number one thing to do. All the other things are going to be window dressing on top of it. So there's no particular probiotic I would blanket recommend to everybody. If someone is having irritable bowel syndrome, Alpha-Rex is quite a good probiotic that's been actually well researched in relation to that. There's lots of them out there. So I would say talk to your dietitian and see what your specific symptoms are, and they might be able to give you more specific advice on what's going on. I have an 8-year-old with Down syndrome with huge sensory issues and wants only foods for wet pasta, rice, gravy. Yeah, I mean, that's really, really common. And you will actually see, we do see more celiac disease in people with Down syndrome. It's definitely, we should be screening people with Down syndrome for celiac disease. But I mean, sensory issues can be huge. And do you know something, I could talk to you all day on that one, but we did run a course just a couple of weeks ago on sort of fussy eating and those kind of sensory issues. So if you want to have a look back on that, that's available on the website. Or if you want to get in touch with us at the Celiac Society, maybe I can give you some more help with that. I was having issues with gluten-free porridge and cut it out in the past week. How long may it take to feel better in the mornings? So if you think the porridge is the issue, the first thing, as I mentioned earlier, is make sure you've all oats coming out, because if you just sort of take out the porridge, but then you're eating bread that has oats in it, you're not going to feel anything. I would give it 6 to 8 weeks and see if you're feeling any better. It can just take a little bit of time, a little like when you're diagnosed with celiac disease. Some people feel great immediately, and some people it actually takes weeks and months to feel better. But I would generally, I'd at least give it 8 weeks with that, maybe even 3 months, just to see how you're feeling with it. Now, I've been having digestive issues, constipation and diarrhea. Introduced more fibre last 4 weeks. Found digestive gastritis. So God love you. Would this be a cause also, and the reason the extra fibre isn't working yet? So gastritis, we don't usually see constipation linked with that, but it will make you very, very uncomfortable with it. To be honest, if you're swinging between constipation and diarrhea, it's unlikely to be fibre. That's the problem. Now, I can't know for definite sitting down with this. I'm really talking very generally here. I would be inclined to look, and if you're celiac, and I'm assuming you are, I'd be really having a good look at gluten coming in somewhere. or gluten contamination. And if you're 100% certain that's not happening, maybe have a look at oats if you're eating it. But the fact that you're swinging from one to the other, I don't think fibre is going to be the solution for that necessarily. So I maybe check in with your dietitian and just see if they can just check you out for that one. My one bad experience was early on in almost 30 years of the gluten-free diet. I'm definitely on top of the diet by now. When I say after 30 years, fair play to you. I hope you are. Okay, I think, let me just see. Okay, one other question. Are chickpeas gluten-free? I think I bought a tin of chickpeas one time and only discovered when I got home that it says it strictly wasn't. So one of those things is that when you actually go into a supermarket, I don't know if you know, but you'll actually have upwards of 60,000 different foods and different products in one sort of supermarket with that. And what happens there is that we, from the Celiac Society, and I have to emphasize, we're a small team on small funding. So we actually do a huge amount of kind of with what we've got to talk to all the manufacturers to kind of say what's in your products, what's gluten-free, is there cross-contamination? And we get as much as we can into the food list and onto the food app for that. But you know, you have so many different manufacturers. What can happen is, and it does happen sometimes, a recipe changes over the year or the supplier changes. So you might have someone who's making tins of chickpeas and the chickpeas they're getting from this supplier are definitely gluten-free. And then that supplier for 1 week just can't supply and they have to get to a different supplier, and then this supplier isn't gluten-free. And so you might have a brand that today is gluten-free, but then tomorrow suddenly just once, and it might only be for a week or two, there's a may contain gluten on it. So as much as we can, we'll be in touch with manufacturers, they let us know and we put out the alerts. So that's where you'll often see the additions and deletions on the food list. And that's one of the reasons that happens. But for yourself, we'd always say, yes, the food list, we've gone into really big detail on it, but just always, I would just check the label as well, and just does it say if it might contain gluten. So that does happen sometimes with it. Now, certain brands would be consistently gluten-free and they're really good, but yeah, it does happen with that. And what we're finding, and I think one of the issues in the last few years, there's more people moving into sort of vegan and vegetarian diets, so there's more demand for beans and lentils. And it just seems to be, and I'm guessing here, maybe it's just we've so many other suppliers coming in that maybe there's just that little bit more may contain gluten we're seeing. Particularly, I said lentils recently are just becoming an issue with that, so just check. Is there a range of supplements that are gluten-free? I'm low on vitamin B12 and need a supplement. Should I just get the B complex or just a B12? Either will work. So a B12 supplement is a tablet, or a B complex that has B12 in it will work. If you're low in B12, though, just check and make sure that it comes back up again on the supplement, because sometimes you might need an injection. Sometimes people actually have trouble absorbing vitamin B12 and they might need an injection for it. If you're newly diagnosed, it's quite common to have low B12, so that should come back up once you're on your gluten-free diet and once you start having your B12. If you've been diagnosed a long time and your B12 has dropped, I'd have a look, just check. Now, sometimes people aren't eating enough B12, so your B12 is in animal food, so meat, chicken, fish would be really big sources, eggs, and then you'll get some in milk. But if you don't eat any of those foods, you would definitely need to have a supplement, or maybe if you like those foods, to bring more of them back in. Well, you've had the injections. Now, I'll tell you, I'm going to just briefly go into that, because with vitamin B12, B12 is a funny vitamin in that when you eat it, it won't just absorb on its own. It has to come in, it has to connect to another sort of compound in your stomach. And for some people, they stop making that compound. And if that's you, it has a lovely name. It's called pernicious anemia. But if that's you, you will only ever be able to get your B12 up with injections. So just be cautious on that. Now, sometimes what I would see is people who were celiac for years, but nobody realized they, even eating the B12 wasn't putting up, so they were getting injections. So I've seen a lot of people who were on B12 injections, and then once they're diagnosed celiac, they don't need to be on them anymore. But for yourself, just in case you have that pernicious anemia, because you can have that as well, it's another autoimmune condition, just make sure, just keep an eye on that B12. So even if you're taking your supplements, in a few weeks, will you go back and actually, or even where we now, gave it maybe 8 to 12 weeks, and just check, make sure your B12 did come back up, so that you know. Now, what was the next one? Sorry. Should my anti-transglutaminase IgA test be 0? My most recent test was 0.6. I've never had a positive TTG, even at my sickest, so I'm not bothered about a high number, just that it's not 0. It'll very rarely be 0. Even someone without celiac disease, you'll often have a low level with it. And it's quite common actually to have a very low TTG and still have celiac disease around. 8 to 10% of people with celiac disease will actually be negative on the blood test. No, I wouldn't be looking for it all the way down to 0. I mean, we want it as low as you can, but no, I wouldn't be too worried at that level. I wouldn't be worried about. I'm a veggie. I've been eating beans and lentils for years. I never thought about gluten being in lentils. Is there a brand that's consistently gluten-free? There used to be. But like I'm just saying, in the last year, it is, there was always one or two that would have may contain gluten here and there, but we're seeing a lot more recently. So we're actually talking to a lot of manufacturers at the moment just to see if we can kind of get to the bottom of it, or if we can get, some of it segregated in some way for people. So yeah, so it's just on the packs. You'll see on some dried lentils, most of them would be naturally gluten-free, but if you just look on the back, sometimes they'll say may contain gluten, and hopefully we'll have a more comprehensive list in this year's food list, because as I said, it's just really come up as an issue in the last while with it. Now, I think that is all of our questions for today. Is anybody else any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it all up here. Give you one more minute. Okay, well, that seems to be everything. Well, thank you very much for joining today, and really thanks for all the questions. It's lovely that people are joining in with that. So as I said, we have recorded this. This is going to be available on our website, so do look out for that coming up, or if you know anyone else who might be interested in seeing it, do just pass that on. So thank you. Have a good day.